Gavin Biggs is going to be talking about shelter design for a changing paradigm, and I'm very excited about this talk, as I said already. He's a graduate of the University of New South Wales, earning a Master's in Business and Technology in 2004. He joined Therian in 2006, having worked in multiple disciplines across the commercial construction industry for over 18 years. Gavin has a passion for human and animal movement that showcases itself in dynamic and engaging animal facility design. He travels extensively around the world to ensure that he is abreast of all the latest ideas in animal care and management. Since 2006, he's been heavily involved in designing and project managing many animal facilities. Gavin sees his success as the success of his clients and the animals in their care and the long-term relationships that have prevailed past the project's completion dates. Thank you, Gavin.
What'd you do with the clicker? Okay, so I'm going to try and digest what would normally take a whole day into 20 minutes. So I apologise if this is going to be quick. Okay, so I was asked to really give a talk about, what is happening in the shelter world globally, and how what we're seeing and what we're doing to try and address that as our organisation. So we'll get started. So changing and growth are fundamentals in everything we all do. It doesn't matter if we're in the animal sheltering world or just in life in general. It's changing at a very fast pace, and a lot of it has got to do with things like these things called mobile phones. Over the past 5 years, we have certainly seen from an outsider looking in that animal shelters across the world have faced that increased challenge to manage community and public expectation around what is good animal welfare, and that perception around what you do and every day. In many cases, animal shelters have been unable to meet some of those challenges, and that's often due to either the facilities they've got, money available to them, resources, whether it be human resources or other resources. And so how do we help address that? So this is a facility in San Diego that I visited first in 2008, San Diego Humane Society. At the time, it was known to be one of the leading facilities in the US. That one and Oregon Humane Society, those two were sort of seen as the top two in the US in 2008. And the interesting thing that I gathered from both of those when we actually did a lot of analysis was that, and it was interesting just listening to the most recent talks today, was that they looked at the human world and what is happening in the human world and how do we try and address that in the animal world. So that human-animal bond and looking at, breaking down and being more transparent. So I've heard that certainly in the talks over the last couple of days as well. So San Diego, I always saw as, again, I've toured many hundreds of facilities around the world, and San Diego at the time when I went there in 2008 was very inspirational because they worked with human behaviourists in the design of their shelter. They worked very closely with the local council. The two facilities sat right next door to each other, and the picture on the bottom left there was the intake, which was right between the two, council and the Humane Society. So it was very interesting looking at it. But again, I've been back more recently to that facility and started to realise, well, they're now struggling with the facility they've got to meet some of the new expectations that the local community are putting on that shelter. So there are always, and will always be, fundamentals of shelter life. The need to be functional while welcoming. The need to make a statement, but not too extravagant. A statement that benefactors or taxpayers question where their money is going. So if you're a council or a not-for-profit charity. The need to showcase pets looking for their forever home in a way that ensures the safety of those animals, their prospective owners and the staff, and obviously the well-being of those pets. The need to serve the community while keeping an eye on the changing demographics and anticipating those future needs. That's always a big struggle. We see that all the time. So those photos on the left were all at San Diego. So the top photo was looking in the main foyer as you walked in. It had this big glass roof, which was quite extravagant. And then the middle one was looking into the communal cat area. And then out the front, the silhouettes of the dogs and cats in the gardens. So the role of the animal shelter is shifting to very much that community welfare centre or a community resource. So we are certainly seeing that both here and certainly in the US when I was only just there 2 weeks ago. You know, we're seeing that it's very much becoming a resource for the community to be educated, to work with foster carers, to work with other rescue groups. So it's very much this facility has to do a lot in usually a very small space. So that's one of the challenges that we have to try and face. And how do we meet those expectations? I know, and even our clients here in Australia, it's very difficult. They struggle with this question all the time. So how do we adapt as a facility? So when we make some of these decisions on what to do, where to go and how to achieve it, there are a couple of starting points. The first thing we need to do is building decisions that we need to take to account to project that growth and the demographics. So this is data. You've heard it over the last couple of days. Data is king. It's a bit like cash is king in the world as well. Data is the other king. Understanding your demographic, understanding your animal statistics, all these things, gather as much data as you can, capture and review your shelter's animal data. You know, it's amazing when we ask shelters for their data, what the information that we get, it's quite different, very broad. And I know in the US they tried to try and address that with the Asilomar Accord, and some shelters here are following that, others are not. You know, the length of stay, when you ask a shelter what their average length of stay is for cats, dogs, I get quite varied answers on that. Well, it all depends on X, Y, Z. You know, so it would be nice if we could all be on the same page when it comes to data. And the other one I heard earlier in one of the talks was GIS mapping as well. You know, if you don't know how to do it, find someone that can, because that information is really, really helpful in determining what trends are occurring in your community. And redefining that space for a community shelter or pound requires, you know, challenging that status quo. So to meet this changing paradigm, the design needs to consider the animal shelter or pound as a community resource. So really start thinking of it as that. You know, getting away from, you know, having 50, 60 dog kennels all in one big long row. We just don't do that sort of design anymore. You know, start thinking about it as, you know, well, what is that space going to be? You know, dog numbers are starting to decrease across the country. So, you know, coming into a shelter. So how are we addressing that? What are we using that space that, you know, we might have 100 kennels in our shelter. Well, what are we going to use it for in 5 years' time if we're not using it for dogs, for housing of dogs? You know, I heard just in that previous talk about, well, maybe it's longer term, you know, care and rehabilitation of dogs. So facility designs must be adaptable to allow that shelter to reinvent their spaces to meet that change. You know, try not to build too many big solid walls everywhere. We need to be able to adapt for that change. So here's an example of a shelter, which a couple of people in the audience may know what that is. So I'm going to, this facility is not built as yet, but these are the things that we've started thinking about for this shelter. So these are all the areas that the shelter is currently being thought about. I'm starting to paint the picture there for you. So you see there we've got, in the top half of the photo, we've got dog pods. So yeah, gone are the days where we have these big, you know, buildings full of dogs. We just don't do that anymore. We try and stick to sort of maximum of 10 pens together. It's much easier for staff to manage, volunteers to work in. You know, disease control. There's many different things that the smaller dog pod arrangement, and we do the same thing for cats. So dogs and cats, we now are very much a lot smaller pod type arrangements. We can reuse those rooms, those buildings for other things if we need to in the future. We don't have to think about, I've got this huge building, what am I going to do with it? We've now got much smaller buildings to change. And then we have, our administration buildings. How do we attract people to the facility? Do we add cafes? Do we add, other social enterprises like commercial boarding, dogs and cats? Do we do a veterinary hospital, whether it be a community vet hospital or a for-profit vet hospital? These are all the things that we need to think about. What is the community expecting from you as a shelter? So what if we have to change some of these things? So here's an example of just suddenly changing some of these items. So do we add a community centre instead of the cafe? So just thinking a little bit more broadly, when you're looking at your shelter, how do we change the shelter if we need to into the future? How do we not make it so it's so robust and set in its place so that we can adapt for those things in the future? Transparency. I heard that in one of the talks earlier within the shelter. That's something I'm definitely seeing overseas, certainly in the US. Some of these photos on the left, the top one is actually a corridor. You walk down and you can actually see spay neuters happening in the veterinary hospital while you're walking down the corridor. The general public can walk down and see it. But interestingly, on the path to that window, there's a whole bunch of education going on the walls. There's volunteers sitting there talking to you about the services, the things that we do within the shelter. These are great things to get your community engaged in your shelter. Start showing them what you do. I don't know how many shelters I go to, and it's just closed door. You go nothing past the reception. Let's start exploring, how do you get your community engaged in your shelter? It's the quickest way of getting those animals out of the shelters. Get your community engaged. Showcasing all that valuable work that you do. You guys do a huge amount of work. I'm always in awe when I go to any shelter and see the work that you do and some of the environments that you're working in. I can tell you my staff wouldn't want to work in some of those environments. Education starts at the front door of the shelter, whether it be with volunteers or signage or windows into areas of the hospital. The more the community knows about the shelter and the important work you do, the more engaged they'll be, the quicker you'll get animals out of those shelters. The shelter needs to make it very easy for people to help. So having the facilities for foster carers to come to the shelter. I was at one 2 weeks ago in the US in Kansas City. They had the lady that looked after the foster carers, she worked in a shoebox. It was literally about a 2 by 2 metre little room, and she couldn't see anyone in that room because she couldn't literally swing the cat in the room. It was so small. She had piles of all the foster care kits in her room with her. She managed 700 foster carers, all in this tiny little 2 by 2 metre room. And I said, how do you do it? She goes, well, it's challenging, but I do it. And those sort of things you need to really think about. How are we going to work with foster carers? How are we going to be engaged? She did an amazing job for the tiny little space that she operated in. I couldn't believe it. But really being engaged with your foster carers. How do we do that? How do we educate them? Having spaces to educate them in your facilities. Volunteers, again, often we overlook how we work with volunteers, how we train them, how we get them doing more things within the shelter. There's so many things a volunteer can do. And again, I look at shelters I go to and I go, well, why haven't you provided them with some of the resources, some of the tools, some of the online training or education or things like that to really, get that experience so they can really be a valuable resource to the shelter. And making sure you've got all those check-in points so that you know that they're learning along the way. And having those multi-purpose rooms, those sort of things are really, really important. So, putting some of those plans into action. An animal shelter is a specialised building, and you need to work with people who understand. Yeah, I had to give a talk at the conference in the US recently, and I had to go back and look at the work that we've done as part of my talk. Yeah, we've completed 497 projects across the Asia-Pacific region over the last 15 years, and we're continually learning all the time. I took clients with me in November last year to the US. We toured 18 facilities, and really trying to understand, well, what's going on? You know, what things are changing? How do we help? One of the facilities we went to was the SPCA Dog Behaviour Rehabilitation Centre in South Carolina. We spent the whole day there, and really just trying to learn and understand, well, what is it that you are doing? And by the way, the success rate with dogs was unbelievable. 97.8% of dogs that they brought into the facility got rehabilitated and got forever homes, which was amazing. And trust me, some of these dogs, I looked at them and I went, there's no way that these dogs are going to be rehomable. But they also spent a lot of money on those dogs, a lot of resources. And ASPCA have got a lot of money. Through all of this, the goal is to increase rehoming, decrease costs through efficiencies, and also make sure we look after disease within our facilities. So understand your fundraising capacity, keep building your profile and awareness within the community. These are key things to do, and I know a lot of you already do it. You're looking for gaps in services in your community. So that's something that I don't see a lot of people really doing. But in the US, they are doing that a lot. They are really reaching out and going, so what is it that the community needs? How do we help service that need? And being a lot more engaged. Be cautious about pet projects. I call them pet projects. The latest fad. We need to react, the knee-jerk reactions. Try and avoid those things. We're all guilty of that. I know we are in our company. We always got to say, well, what's the value? What's the end result? What are we trying to achieve? So be always mindful of those things. Because those things can end up costing you a lot of money and a lot of time and get you nowhere. So just be careful. So that mission, increase rehoming rates, increase community awareness, and be a community resource. If you can get nothing out of this talk, is just make sure you be more engaged with your community. So some of the things that we do, so we facilitate a lot of workshops to determine shelter needs. We develop master plans as an example of a recent master plan we've started developing for a shelter. Reviewing animal statistics, so we analyse a lot of data as our company when we work with our clients. Is really what does that data mean? What do we need to do? What are the trends looking for? What's your 5-year plan? What's your 15, 20-year plan? What's the community going to look like? What's the demographic doing? I've got a good friend in Sydney who runs a very big demographic company, and I use his resource a lot. Because it's telling you what's the trends, what's happening in these various regions. Things about, what is the planning permit? A lot of people get really worried about, I've got to go through this whole planning process. I often say, planning permits are just like a game of chess. You've got to have checkmate for council. We've got to have checkmate. So it's just a game of chess. How do we refurbish what you've already got so that it can be flexible? So we look at a lot of those things. Design workflows, efficient designs to enhance that animal care. We do a lot of work around that, about looking at the welfare of the dog or the cat or the horse or whatever it is. How do we make sure we get that that animal? Because being in a stressful environment, it's a very stressful environment in the shelter. One of the greatest things I have seen, and we've been doing a lot of work with, is the challenge yards or challenge courses for dogs. If any of you have seen that, SPCA in Auckland, New Zealand did that a couple of years ago. We did work with them, and since then we've done a few others, and they're great. It's just one-on-one working with a dog on a challenge yard with a whole bunch of obstacles. Mentally gets them very alert. Very, very good. Thank you.